This is a presentation of the 19th Annual Colorado Snow and Avalanche Workshop, a program of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center, Friends of CAIC, and the National Avalanche Center, presented by Dinafit and Pomoka.
Hello, and thanks for stopping by. I'm Pascal Haegeli from Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, British Columbia, where I conduct avalanche safety research with a team of about 10 graduate students. I'm very excited that Seesaw is happening this year despite the obvious challenges, and I feel very fortunate to be part of it. In this presentation, I'm going to share some of the latest results of our research on avalanche risk communication with you. So let's get started. Over the last few winters, a number of my students and I have worked on a series of studies to get insight into how recreationalists use, understand, and apply avalanche bulletin information. The first study consisted of a series of interviews from which Anne Sinclair derived a bulletin user typology. If you were at Seesaw last year, you would have seen Anne present her results. The interviews were followed up with a large-scale online survey in the spring of 2019 to examine bulletin use practices across the larger recreation community. Henry Fenn used the survey to examine whether recreationalists have the necessary skills to use avalanche bulletins at the level they say they do. You can read up on his research in the latest issue of TAR or the Canadian Avalanche Journal. Abby Morgan, another student of mine, is currently looking at the survey questions related to the danger scale to provide insight on how recreationalists perceive and use the avalanche danger scale. Last but not least, Katie Fisher conducted another online survey last spring to examine whether different information presentations and interactivity can make bulletins more effective. In this presentation, I will showcase some of Abby and Katie's latest results. So let's get started with Abby's study. The chart you see on this slide was recently published by Jörg Schweitzer and colleagues in the academic journal The Cryosphere. The chart shows avalanche activity as a function of the danger rating level. The avalanche activity index is a weighted sum of all observed avalanches in a relatively small but well-monitored forecast region around Davos, Switzerland. After calculating the avalanche activity index for each day, the authors plotted avalanche activity against danger rating levels in a series of box plots. One of the key points of this figure is that avalanche activity increases with danger ratings in a non-linear way. The increase from one danger level to the next increases as you move up on the scale. You might refer to this as exponential growth. Several other studies have shown the same similar increase. Now, having an accurate understanding of the nature of the danger rating scale seems critical for making informed choices about backcountry travel. We were therefore curious to learn more about how recreationalists actually perceive the scale. What you see on this slide is a screenshot of our survey question for this research question. The question was, for each of the 5 danger rating levels, use the 2 sliders to indicate the severity of the associated avalanche conditions on a scale from 0, which represents no avalanche hazard at all, to 100, which represents widespread, large natural avalanches reaching valley bottoms. Each participant moved the sliders to express how they think the severity of avalanche conditions relate to the danger rating levels. Now for the analysis, let's rotate the sliders by 90 degrees so that our chart has the same orientation as the figure from Jörg Schweitzer. As an example of a possible answer, the pattern you see on the chart right now represents the evenly spaced ranges with no overlap you saw on the previous slide. Overall, 2,705 participants provided us with their assessments. What you see on the chart now is the distribution of the ranges from the entire data set. To analyze the data, we used a latent class linear mixed effects model, which allows us to fit a regression line through the data points to extract how people perceive the danger scale. We included both linear and quadratic terms to allow the regression line to capture a curved shape. Now, the really cool thing about the latent class models is that they can group participants according to the similarity of their regression lines. This allows us to identify distinct clusters of participants who perceive the danger scale in a particular way. What you see on this slide are the 7 distinct patterns in avalanche danger scale perception that Abby and I identified in our analysis. Each pattern is characterized by the typical ranges for each danger rating level and a regression line that goes through the center point of each range. We don't have enough time to go into the details of each pattern, but roughly half of the participants view the danger scale as a linear scale with evenly spaced and non-overlapping ranges. Another 25% of the sample also view the scale as mainly linear, but the ranges are wider and overlapping. In pattern 4, the range of considerable is substantially wider than the other ranges. While another 20% of the sample perceives the scale to have a convex shape, with the distance between levels decreasing as we go up on the scale, only 6% drew a concave shape similar to what we see in Jörg Schweitzer's chart. To better understand what drives these perceptions, we examined the characteristics of the participants who ended up in these different groups. Turns out that days of backcountry travel per year, which we interpret as engagement, is the most important driving factor. Participants who spend more than 50 days in the backcountry each winter have a significantly lower proportion of the basic linear pattern and a higher proportion of the linear pattern with the wide range at considerable. Avalanche awareness training was less important but had a similar effect. The last factor was experience, with more experienced folks having higher proportions of people who perceived the danger scale as having a convex shape. Interestingly, the people who correctly drew the danger scale as concave did not exhibit a specific user profile. They weren't more trained, more engaged, or more experienced, or anything else. They were a rather random group. Now, the next obvious question of interest is, what do people actually do with the danger rating? To examine this aspect of the bulletin, we included this question in the survey. For each of the 5 avalanche danger ratings, which of the following statement reflects how the particular level affects your decision to go into the backcountry or not? Participants had 4 different options. I go into the backcountry primarily based on danger rating alone. I go into the backcountry mainly based on the danger rating, but I also check other bulletin information. Avalanche problems and forecast details are the basis for my decision whether to go into the backcountry or not. And the last option, the danger rating alone prevents me from going into the backcountry. So completely filled out, participants ended up with a pattern like this. In total, almost 2,500 participants completed this question. This stacked bar chart provides an overview of the complete sample. Some of the key observations include 91% of participants stay at home at extreme based on the danger rating alone, and 62% of participants stay at home at extreme and high based on the danger rating alone. At the other end of the spectrum, 32% go into the backcountry at low primarily based on the danger rating, and 5% do the same thing at low and moderate. Similar to the danger scale perception, we were curious whether there are distinct patterns in how people responded to these questions. Our latent class analysis clustered participants' response patterns into 5 distinct groups. The first 2 patterns, which represent roughly 60% of the sample, stay at home during high and extreme. The left group relies a little bit more on the danger rating than the group on the right. The patterns in the bottom row are similar to the patterns in the top row, with the exception that these folks rely on other bulletin information to make the decision whether to go out or not under high. Similar to the danger rating perception analysis, it is primarily days of backcountry travel per year that determines which of these patterns participants belong to. Participants who go out less than 10 days a winter are more prevalent in the first 2 patterns. Participants who go out 20 days or more are prevalent in pattern 5. Again, avalanche awareness training is only of secondary importance, with more highly trained folks being more prevalent in the patterns in the bottom row. Interestingly, the danger rating perception does not seem to matter at all in how people use the danger scale information. What are the key take-home messages from this analysis? 3 out of 4 recreationalists perceive the danger scale to be linear. Only 6%, less than 1 out of 10, picture the scale as concave, similar to how expert researchers view it. For almost 2/3 of participants, high and extreme simply means staying at home. About 1/3 decide to head into the backcountry when they see low without consulting any additional information. Engagement seems to be more important in determining these use patterns than avalanche awareness training. So let's move on to Katie Fisher's project, which aims to examine how presentation formats affect people's ability to use bulletin information in a meaningful way. One of the aspects that we were interested in was the effectiveness of the graphics for displaying the avalanche problem locations. We have the Canadian graphics, where the aspect and elevation information for each avalanche problem is presented in separate graphics. We have the American graphic, where the aspect and elevation information is combined for each avalanche problem. And in addition, we created a new presentation format that displays the information for all avalanche problems in a single graphic. To test the effectiveness of these graphics, we conducted another online survey last spring, which included a route ranking exercise. Participants were presented with an avalanche bulletin with 2 avalanche problems and a hypothetical mountain landscape with 3 different route options. The task of participants was to rank these routes according to their exposure to avalanche hazard, which we based on their interactions with the avalanche problems. In this particular case, Route C is not exposed to any avalanche problems. Route B is exposed to the wet loose problem at all elevation bands. And Route A is the most exposed because it's exposed to the same wet loose avalanche problem as Route B and the wind slab in the Alpine. We had 8 different avalanche bulletin scenarios in total. Each participant was randomly given 2 bulletin scenarios with the same type of graphic, and they had to complete the ranking task with a simple and a complex set of routes for each. This means that each participant completed 4 route ranking tasks, which resulted in just over 13,000 completed assessments. We then used various regression models to isolate the effect of the presentation format on different aspects of the ranking exercise. These included participants' correctness of the ranking, the time it took them to complete the task, and their preference ratings. In other words, how much they liked the different graphics. So how did this work out? To make the results tangible for you, I'm presenting them in so-called estimated marginal means. These are the estimated performances for the different graphics based on the regression analysis, holding all other model parameters constant. So when you look at these numbers, you should primarily focus on the differences between them and not the absolute values themselves. So let's look at the chance of completing the ranking task correctly first. Everything else being the same, the chance of completing the task correctly was roughly 8 percentage points higher for participants who were presented with the American graphic. There was no significant difference between the Canadian and the new graphic. So we have a clear winner in this category. With respect to completion time, participants presented with the American and new graphic were roughly 10 seconds faster than if they were given the Canadian graphic. We take this result to mean that combining the elevation and aspect information takes considerable mental effort, whereas combining the information for the 2 different problems is much easier. So here we have 2 winners, and the Canadian graphic is a distant third. In our analysis of the preference ratings, we found several interactions, which means that how much people liked a graphic depends on the interplay with other variables. For example, Americans really liked their own graphic, whereas Canadians liked their graphic equally well as the American, but overall at a lower level. It also mattered which graphic participants used during the route ranking exercise. Overall, participants liked the American graphic the best, but the difference was smaller among participants who used other graphics. Finally, we found an interesting pattern with Avalanche training. Again, the American icon was consistently rated highest by all training levels, but the preference for the new graphic was dependent on participants' training level. Participants with less training liked it more, and participants with professional level training liked it considerably less. So overall, the American graphic is clearly the most preferred. Let's briefly summarize these results. The American graphic is the clear winner as it outperformed the other graphics in all aspects. The race for second was tight, but the new graphic prevailed due to the faster completion times, which we interpret as it being easier to process. We believe that our results nicely show how combining the aspect and elevation information does take considerable effort and can lead to interpretation errors. Another important result of our analysis is that people generally like what they're used to. So if you're planning to change the format presentation in your bulletin, expect some resistance. Now, in addition to the analysis that I presented you here, there are many more aspects to our latest survey which we're still in the process of analyzing. For example, we're looking at the effect of feedback on people's performance in the route ranking task, and we're examining the usefulness of travel advice statements. So stay tuned, there will be more results coming soon. Let's wrap up with a few general take-home messages from our research on Avalanche Bulletin users. First, Avalanche Bulletin users are highly diverse with substantially different needs, expectations, use patterns, perceptions, and skills. Having an in-depth understanding of the various user types is critical for creating meaningful products. Second, the way we present the information really matters, and the best presentation might be different for different user groups. We feel that explicitly testing the effectiveness of different Avalanche Bulletin components offers great insight for future developments. Another important take-home message from our studies is that recreationalists seem hungry for training opportunities and feedback on their hazard assessment skills. The feedback we receive for our surveys is overwhelmingly positive, and people really like these exercises. We think that Avalanche Bulletins are in a unique position to provide these training opportunities. Recreationalists typically take an avalanche safety course once or twice in their backcountry career, but the vast majority of them look at the Avalanche Bulletin every time they go into the backcountry. This means that we should think about ways to integrate feedback and training opportunities into our Avalanche Bulletins to take them from pure condition reports to training tools that can play a critical role in avalanche awareness education. To finish, we want to thank all the different agencies that helped the funding, design, and promotion of our surveys, and we thank everybody who took the time to complete our surveys. It would not be possible for us to do this research without your dedication. I hope you enjoyed this whirlwind tour of our latest research on avalanche risk communication. If you have any questions about this research or our research program in general, feel free to email me or check out our website at avalancheresearch.ca. Have a great winter and bye for now.